At exactly 8 p.m., in a quiet Texas neighborhood where nothing unusual ever seemed to happen, a doorbell camera activated. Most people imagine cameras as protection, silent guardians watching over the edges of ordinary life. But sometimes those small black lenses capture something far more disturbing than a thief or a lost package. Sometimes they record moments that feel wrong, moments that leave questions no one can answer. On November 22, 2019, a Ring camera in Harriet Creek Ranch, Texas, recorded 8 seconds of footage that would haunt thousands of people online for years. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, a child approaching a front porch. But within seconds, the atmosphere changed. A young girl stepped into frame holding a flashlight. She wasn't calm, she wasn't curious, she wasn't playing. She was terrified. Her shoulders were tight, her breathing looked rushed, and every few seconds she turned around, checking the darkness behind her, like something might be following her. Then she knocked. Not the casual knock of someone visiting a friend. It was desperate, urgent, the kind of knocking that comes from someone who believes the next few seconds might decide whether they live or die. "Help, please." The words were barely loud enough for the microphone to catch them, but they carried a weight that viewers would later replay thousands of times. Because this wasn't acting. Anyone who studies human fear can see the difference, the micro-movements, the frantic eyes, the tension in the body. This girl believed she was in danger. She kept looking over her shoulder again and again and again, as if something was moving in the darkness just outside the camera's field of view. And then came the most disturbing part. No one answered the door. Because the house was empty. The homeowners were away on vacation, hundreds of miles from the quiet porch where a terrified child was begging for help. For nearly a minute she stood there, knocking, pleading, looking back into the darkness, and then she disappeared. By the time the homeowners reviewed the footage days later, the girl was long gone. No neighbors reported seeing her. No parents came forward. No missing child matched the description. It was as if she had stepped out of the darkness and then vanished right back into it. But that's when the internet began asking a far more unsettling question. What if the camera didn't just capture a random moment of fear? What if it recorded the final moment someone tried to escape something they were never meant to escape from? And that question is where the real story begins.
When investigators first examined the footage, they expected the mystery to unravel quickly. Most doorbell camera cases do. A neighbor recognizes the person. A parent calls the police. Someone eventually says, "Oh, that's just a kid from down the street." But this time, nothing happened. No parents, no neighbors, no explanation. The girl simply did not exist in the community. Police released the footage, hoping someone would identify her. Within hours, the video began spreading across the internet like wildfire. Millions of people watched the same chilling scene unfold, the flashlight shaking in her small hand, the frantic knocking, the terrified glances over her shoulder. And everyone asked the same question: who was she running from? Because human beings have instincts about fear. We can sense when someone is pretending and when someone is truly terrified. Every movement of that child screamed real panic. The way she held the flashlight too tightly, the way she whispered instead of shouting, as if she was afraid of attracting attention. And most disturbing of all, the way she kept checking the darkness behind her, over and over, like she knew something might be coming. Soon, the internet began forming theories. One of the most common was something law enforcement officers know all too well, a tactic used by criminals. The idea was simple and chilling. Sometimes burglars send a child to the door, a frightened child, a woman pretending to be in distress, someone who looks harmless enough to make the homeowner open the door without hesitation. Then, the moment the door opens, the real criminals rush in from hiding. It's a manipulation of human empathy. Our instinct to protect the vulnerable becomes the very weapon used against us. At first, the theory seemed plausible. Maybe someone was hiding just outside the camera's view. Maybe the girl was part of a setup. But when analysts slowed down the footage frame by frame, something didn't feel right. The fear in her voice was too real. Children can act, but genuine terror produces movements the brain can't fake. Subtle tremors, breathing patterns, eye movements that psychologists call survival scanning. And that girl was scanning constantly, not like someone pretending, like someone hunted. Then someone online noticed something that made the entire mystery even darker. A missing child case from earlier that year. A girl who had vanished hundreds of miles away. A girl whose disappearance had already left investigators with more questions than answers. Her name was Serenity Denard. And when people compared the images side by side, a chilling possibility emerged. What if the girl knocking on that door in Texas wasn't just lost? What if she had been missing for 9 months, and this camera captured the moment she tried to escape the people who took her?
To understand why that theory shook people so deeply, you have to understand the story of Serenity Denard. Because her disappearance was already one of the most haunting missing child cases in America. On February 3, 2019, 9-year-old Serenity Denard vanished from a youth treatment facility near Rockerville, South Dakota. The facility was supposed to be a place of protection, a quiet rural campus surrounded by forest where children with emotional and behavioral challenges could receive care. But that afternoon, something went wrong. Staff members noticed Serenity running. At first, they assumed it was another attempt to wander off. She had struggled with emotional instability and had a history of trying to leave places where she felt trapped. They believed she would stop or turn around or get tired. But she didn't. Instead, she ran straight through the tree line. Beyond those trees stretched miles of dense forest and rugged terrain, a landscape that could swallow a person whole if they didn't know where they were going. Within minutes, staff members realized the situation was serious. They called for help. Search teams arrived, and what followed became one of the largest search operations the region had ever seen. More than 200 volunteers combed through the forest. Helicopters scanned from above. Dogs followed scent trails that faded mysteriously into the wilderness. Hours turned into days. Days turned into weeks. But Serenity Denard was never found. No clothing, no footprints, no sign she had ever been there. Authorities eventually proposed the most logical explanation, that she became lost in the forest and died from exposure. Hypothermia is silent and fast, especially for a child. But even that theory had holes. Search dogs should have found something. Volunteers should have found something. 200 people walking grid patterns through miles of forest rarely miss every clue. Yet in this case, the wilderness remained silent. Months passed. the case grew colder. Then, in November of that same year, the Texas doorbell footage appeared online, and suddenly the impossible question entered the conversation. What if Serenity never died in the forest? What if someone found her first? What if the girl on that porch, holding a flashlight, whispering for help, was a child who had been taken somewhere far away? And what if those 8 seconds of footage captured the only moment she ever managed to escape? Because if that were true, then the darkness behind her wasn't just the night. It might have been the person she was running from.
When the internet connected the doorbell footage to Serenity Denard, the theory spread faster than investigators could control. People began comparing everything: the girl's height, her voice, the way she moved. Frame by frame, pixel by pixel, strangers across the world studied those 8 seconds like detectives searching for truth inside a puzzle. And the similarities were unsettling. The age appeared close, the build looked similar. Even the nervous way the girl shifted her weight from foot to foot felt eerily familiar to people who had seen earlier videos of Serenity. But there was one problem, a major one. Serenity's family watched the footage themselves, and they said the girl was not her. For most people, that should have ended the speculation. A parent usually knows their own child better than anyone. But something about the footage refused to let the internet move on. Because unresolved mysteries trigger something deep inside the human mind. We are pattern-seeking creatures. When pieces almost fit together, our brains refuse to stop searching. And the truth was this: if the girl wasn't Serenity Denard, then the situation might actually be worse. Because that meant there was another terrified child somewhere whose identity no one could explain. Police tried to track every possible lead. They canvassed the neighborhood. They checked nearby security cameras. They looked for any vehicle that might have passed through the area that night. Nothing. No footsteps, no witnesses, no car headlights visible on surrounding cameras. The girl appeared, and then she vanished, as if the darkness simply swallowed her. Years have passed since that night in Texas. The footage still exists online. People still watch it. And every time someone presses play, the same unsettling realization creeps in. Doorbell cameras were invented to watch for strangers. But what happens when the camera captures someone who desperately needs help, and no one is there to answer? Imagine that moment. A frightened child standing on a porch, believing that behind that door is safety, warm light, adults who can protect her. But instead, there is only silence, a locked house, and the slow realization that she is still alone, still outside, still exposed to whatever darkness forced her to run there in the first place. And if you listen closely to those recordings, you can hear something subtle in her voice. Not just fear, but fading hope. Because when the final knock echoes through the empty house, the girl stops waiting. She turns, looks into the night one last time, and walks away, towards something the camera never captured, towards something we may never know. And disturbing as that story is, it wasn't the only moment a doorbell camera recorded something that revealed just how thin the line is between normal life and sudden terror. Because the next incident proves something even darker.
Sometimes the danger doesn't come from the shadows. Sometimes it comes from someone you once trusted.
On the morning of July 31st, 2022, the quiet routine of a small town in Ohio was about to collide with something far more volatile than anyone expected. The house looked ordinary, a typical suburban home, a driveway, a front porch, a doorbell camera mounted beside the door, like millions of others across America. Nothing about it suggested that within minutes it would record a confrontation that would later decide the fate of a man in court. At around 11 a.m., 22-year-old Allison returned home with her mother after breakfast. It was a calm morning, nothing unusual, just the kind of normal day people rarely remember. But as they stepped out of their car, another vehicle slowly pulled into the driveway behind them. At first, Allison didn't recognize it. Then the driver stepped out, and her stomach dropped. It was her ex-boyfriend, James Rail. They had broken up more than a year earlier, 18 months of silence between them. No contact, no relationship, just the distance that usually forms after people move on with their lives. But the night before, something had happened. James had sent a voice message, not threatening, not violent, just strange. His voice sounded uncertain, unstable, like someone struggling to hold themselves together. He said he wanted to talk. He said it had been a long time. He said he felt something he couldn't explain. And he ended the message with a quiet request for her to call him back. She never did. Most people wouldn't. Sometimes ignoring someone is the clearest message you can send. But for reasons no one fully understands, James decided silence was not an answer he would accept. So he drove to her house, without permission, without warning. And as Allison watched the live doorbell camera feed from inside the house, she felt something instinctive rise in her chest. That quiet internal alarm humans evolved over thousands of years. The signal that whispers, "Something about this isn't safe." James walked up the steps. He rang the doorbell, and then he waited. For a moment, it looked like a normal visit, but when the door didn't open, something shifted. The waiting turned into agitation. The agitation turned into agitation, and the calm man who left that quiet voice message the night before started revealing something far more unpredictable. Because sometimes the most dangerous people aren't strangers in the dark. Sometimes they're people who believe they deserve access to your life, even after you've closed the door.
At first, James Rail looked like a man trying to stay calm. Doorbell cameras are strange like that. They record the subtle shifts in human behavior that most people would never notice in real time. The pacing, the glances, the tension building behind someone's eyes. James stood on the porch waiting. 10 seconds, 20, 30. Inside the house, Allison and her family watched silently through the live camera feed. They had no intention of opening the door. The relationship had ended long ago, and his sudden appearance already felt like a violation of a boundary she had clearly set. But James didn't leave. Instead, he kept looking at the door, as if he knew someone was standing just a few feet away on the other side. Minutes passed. Most people would eventually walk away after being ignored. James didn't. Something inside him began shifting from patience to frustration. He stepped closer to the door, pressed the bell again, then again. Each time the sound echoed through the house, sharper than before. Still no answer. That's when the first sign of real agitation appeared. He stepped off the porch. For a moment it looked like he was finally leaving, but the camera kept recording. Instead of walking back to his car, James slowly circled the side of the house. He disappeared from the doorbell camera's view. Inside the house, the tension grew heavier, because when someone disappears from the camera, you no longer know where they are. Seconds later, Allison's father moved toward the windows, trying to see what James was doing outside. The camera captured only the empty porch. Then footsteps returned. James walked back into frame, but he looked different now, more intense, more determined, like a man who had just decided something. He walked straight up to the door, and instead of ringing the bell again, he grabbed the handle. He twisted it, once, twice, locked. His body stiffened. Then he knocked, hard, not the polite knock of a visitor, the sharp pounding of someone who believes the door should open. Inside, Allison's family could now hear the force of the blows through the wood, but James didn't stop. He began forcing the handle, shaking the door, slamming his fists against it. The polite visitor was gone. Now there was only a man trying to get inside a house where he was clearly not welcome. And in that moment, Allison's father realized something that every homeowner fears. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a threat. And the camera continued recording every second as the situation moved toward a decision that would change multiple lives forever.
Inside the house, time seemed to slow down. Every heavy strike against the door echoed through the hallway like a warning. The sound wasn't just loud, it was desperate. Each bang carried the kind of force that comes from someone whose emotions have already crossed the line between frustration and obsession. Outside, James Rail had stopped pretending he was just visiting. He gripped the doorknob again and again, twisting with both hands now, shoulders tightening with effort. When that didn't work, he slammed his fist into the door. Once, twice, again. The camera caught everything, his face tightening, his breathing growing heavier, the way he looked around the porch as if trying to find another way inside. Inside the house, Allison's father was already making the call. He dialed the police. His voice remained calm, but every parent understands the calculation happening in that moment. A stranger trying to force entry into your home is one thing, but this wasn't a stranger. This was someone who once had emotional access to his daughter, someone who might believe he had a right to be there. And people who feel entitled to someone else's life can become dangerously unpredictable when they're denied. Outside, James stepped back from the door. For a moment, it looked like the situation might finally end. But instead of walking away, he took a few steps backwards, staring at the house like a man trying to decide something. Then he moved forward again, this time with even more force. His shoulder slammed against the door. The frame rattled. Inside the house, Allison could hear the wood bending slightly with each impact. It was no longer just aggressive knocking.
It was an attempt to break in. The police were on their way, but everyone inside knew the uncomfortable truth about emergencies. Sometimes help takes minutes, and minutes can be far too long. So Allison's father did what many homeowners in America are legally allowed to do when they believe their family is in immediate danger. He retrieved his firearm, not because he wanted to use it, but because the man outside had already made a decision to cross a line. And once that line is crossed, the responsibility to protect your home becomes very real. Outside, James slammed his shoulder against the door again, harder this time. The camera captured the moment his patience finally disappeared. Inside, the family stood waiting, the phone call with police still active, the tension so thick it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Because the next few seconds were about to decide something permanent, not just about a broken relationship, but about life and death. The moment finally arrived in silence. For several seconds, the camera showed only the porch, the door, and James standing there breathing heavily, his frustration now fully exposed. Inside the house, the situation had already crossed a line that could not be ignored. When someone pounds on a door with that kind of force, when they try the handle repeatedly, when they circle the property looking for another way in, every instinct inside a home begins screaming the same message. This is no longer safe. The police were still on their way, but help had not arrived yet, and James had already proven he wasn't leaving voluntarily. Outside, he stepped back again. Then he lunged forward one more time, throwing his shoulder into the door with enough force to shake the frame. Wood groaned. The lock held, but barely. Inside, Allison's father understood something that every homeowner hopes they will never have to face. A door is only a barrier, and barriers eventually fail. In that moment, he had seconds to decide how far he would allow this to go. The law allows people to defend their homes, but no one truly understands that responsibility until they stand in a hallway, hearing someone trying to break their way in. Another slam against the door, another violent rattle of the handle, and then the confrontation reached its breaking point. What happened next unfolded quickly, but it would be replayed and analyzed for months afterward. A gunshot echoed through the house. Outside on the porch, James collapsed. The doorbell camera didn't capture the moment from inside the home, but it recorded the sudden stillness that followed. Moments earlier, the porch had been filled with tension and movement. Now, there was only silence. Police arrived minutes later to a scene no one had expected when the morning began. Allison's father explained exactly what had happened. Officers reviewed the camera footage almost immediately. Every second, every knock, every attempt to force the door. The video told the story clearly. This had not been a misunderstanding. It had been an escalation, one that ended the moment the door stopped being just a door and became the last line protecting the people inside. In court, weeks later, the footage became the most important witness, because cameras don't panic, they don't exaggerate, they simply show what happened. After reviewing the evidence, the court ruled the shooting was self-defense. The father was acquitted of all charges. Legally, the case was closed, but the video left behind a darker realization. Doorbell cameras were supposed to record harmless moments, deliveries, neighbors, kids playing in driveways. Yet again and again, they end up capturing the exact moment when ordinary life collides with something violent. And sometimes the camera shows us something even stranger. Not anger, not crime, but something that feels almost ritualistic. Because the next recording didn't show a desperate child or a furious ex-boyfriend. It showed a man standing silently on a porch, wearing a red goat mask, holding a box, and leaving behind a message from one of the darkest passages ever written. Late one night in North Texas, a homeowner received a notification that most people barely think about anymore. A small vibration in the pocket, a quiet buzz from a phone. Motion detected at your front door. Millions of people receive that same alert every day. Usually it's a delivery driver, a neighbor, maybe someone knocking on the wrong house. But this notification was different. Because when the homeowner opened the live feed from the doorbell camera, what appeared on the screen didn't look like a normal visitor. It looked like something out of a ritual. Standing on the porch was a man dressed completely in black. Black hoodie, black pants, black gloves. His posture was strangely still, almost deliberate, like someone standing on a stage waiting for a cue. But the most disturbing part wasn't the clothing, it was the mask. A bright red goat mask with exaggerated horns and hollow eye sockets. The face stared directly at the camera lens, unmoving. For a moment, the homeowner assumed it was a prank. Halloween costumes, online challenges, teenagers trying to scare people for social media. Things like that happen all the time. But something about this felt different. The man stepped closer to the door. The camera's microphone picked up the faint sound of his breathing. Then he rang the doorbell. Not repeatedly, just once, a single press. After that, he slowly placed a cardboard box on the ground in front of the door, carefully, almost ceremonially. Then he stepped back and revealed the object leaning against the wall beside him. A sign. Written across the sign was a passage reference, Revelation 20, 1-15. Anyone familiar with biblical texts knows that this particular passage is not gentle scripture. It describes the binding of Satan, the final judgment, the resurrection of the dead, and the eternal punishment of the condemned. In other words, it describes the end of the world. The man stood there for another few seconds, staring directly into the camera as if he wanted the homeowner to read the message. Then he turned, walked calmly down the porch steps, and disappeared into the darkness. When police later arrived and checked the box, it contained nothing. No object, no letter, no explanation, just empty cardboard. The man had not technically committed a crime. He hadn't threatened anyone. He hadn't damaged property. Legally, it was simply a strange visit. But psychologically, it left the homeowner deeply shaken, because the question lingered long after the porch was empty. Why would someone travel to a random house in the middle of the night, dressed like a demonic figure, only to leave behind a message about final judgment? Was it a prank, a performance, or a message meant for someone inside that house? No one ever found the man in the red goat mask. The media reported the incident briefly and then quietly moved on. But the footage remained online, and people who watched it noticed something unsettling. The man never once looked around to see if anyone else was watching. His eyes stayed locked on the camera the entire time, almost like he knew exactly who his real audience was. Not the homeowner, but everyone who would eventually watch the video. Because sometimes the most disturbing thing a camera captures isn't violence, it's intention. And the next moment recorded by a doorbell camera would reveal something far darker than a cryptic visitor. It would capture the final visitor a woman ever allowed into her home.
In the quiet town of Dudley in the United Kingdom, 58-year-old Sharon Gordon lived a life that looked peaceful from the outside. Her home sat on a quiet street, the kind of place where neighbors waved to each other, where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen. For years, the biggest concern on that street had been things like late deliveries or noisy construction. Ironically, construction would become the reason Sharon's life ended. For more than a year, she had been working with a contractor named Peter Norgrove. He had been hired to build an extension to her house. At first, the project seemed ordinary, a professional agreement, paperwork signed, money exchanged. But construction projects have a way of revealing people's true patience. Weeks turned into months, deadlines passed, work stalled. According to reports later revealed in court, the extension dragged on for nearly 15 months. Delays piled up. The quality of the work reportedly began slipping, and tension slowly built between homeowner and contractor. Eventually, Sharon confronted him. Most people imagine confrontations as loud explosions of anger, but the reality is often quieter. A frustrated conversation, a disagreement about money, a demand for accountability. But sometimes that moment of confrontation pushes someone past a line they didn't even realize existed. Days later, Sharon stopped answering calls. At first, her friends assumed she was busy, but when several days passed without hearing from her, two of her friends decided to check on her personally. They walked to the house, knocked on the door. No answer. The door wasn't locked. When they stepped inside, the stillness of the house immediately felt wrong. Then they saw her. Sharon was lying face down near the staircase, blood around her body. The quiet home had become a crime scene. Police arrived quickly and confirmed what no one wanted to believe. It was a homicide. And in modern investigations, detectives no longer rely only on witnesses and physical evidence. They check cameras, security cameras, street cameras, and most importantly, doorbell cameras. Because those small devices often record the last person who ever walked up to a front door. When investigators reviewed Sharon Gordon's doorbell footage, they discovered something critical. The camera had captured the final visitor she allowed into her home, and it was someone she knew, someone who had been working inside that house for more than a year. The contractor, Peter Norgrove. At first, he told investigators Sharon was alive when he left, but cameras are difficult witnesses to lie to, because when the footage was examined more closely, investigators noticed something he couldn't explain. When Peter walked away from the house, there were stains on his trousers. Dark stains, fresh stains. And suddenly, the quiet street in Dudley had an answer to a question no one wanted to ask. What really happened during that final conversation inside Sharon Gordon's home? The camera had captured the last person leaving the house, but the truth about what happened inside those walls would reveal just how quickly ordinary arguments can turn into irreversible violence.
When detectives reviewed the doorbell footage from Sharon Gordon's home, the timeline began forming with disturbing clarity.
The camera showed Peter Norgrove arriving earlier that day like he had many times before. Nothing unusual about it. A contractor showing up to continue work on a project that had already stretched far longer than expected. He walked up the path, carrying tools, dressed like any worker starting another normal day. If someone had watched only those first few seconds, they would have seen nothing alarming. Just another visit from a man who had spent months working inside that house. But cameras don't just record arrivals. They record departures, too. Hours later, the same camera captured Peter leaving the property. At first glance, it looked ordinary again. He stepped out the front door and walked toward the driveway. But investigators are trained to notice details most people miss. One officer paused the footage, zoomed in, then played it again. And there it was. Dark stains across the front of Peter's trousers. Not dust, not mud, blood. It wasn't splattered wildly like in a chaotic struggle. Instead, it appeared in patches, the kind of staining that happens when someone stands close to a victim during a violent attack. Suddenly, his earlier statement to police became impossible to ignore. He had claimed Sharon was alive when he left, but the camera suggested something very different. Detectives returned to Peter for another round of questioning. At first, he repeated the same story. He said they had argued. He said she was frustrated about the construction delays, but he insisted nothing violent had happened. However, investigators had something powerful on their side now. Evidence, doorbell footage, and the stains visible in that video. The pressure began closing in, because once a camera contradicts a story, the truth has a way of forcing itself to the surface. Eventually, the investigation moved to Peter's home, and what they discovered there would remove any remaining doubt about what had happened inside Sharon Gordon's house. Hidden in his shed, investigators found the weapon, a hammer. The same kind of tool he had used countless times while working on construction projects, except this time it had not been used to build something. It had been used to destroy a life. And soon, Peter Norgrove would have to explain exactly how an argument over delayed work turned into a murder. Under questioning, the story began to unravel. Peter Norgrove had spent more than 15 months working on Sharon Gordon's home extension. 15 months of delays, complaints, and growing tension. For Sharon, it had become a nightmare. A construction project that should have taken weeks had stretched into more than a year. According to investigators, she had repeatedly pushed him to finish the work properly or return part of the money she had paid. That final day, the confrontation reached its breaking point. Inside the house, the conversation reportedly started as another argument about the project. Raised voices, frustration, accusations about poor workmanship and missed deadlines. For most people, arguments end with people walking away. But something snapped inside Peter. Maybe it was anger, maybe embarrassment, maybe the realization that he had been caught failing to complete the job. Whatever the reason, the moment escalated into violence. Investigators later determined that Peter grabbed the hammer he had been using for construction work. The attack was sudden, brutal, and over in seconds. Sharon Gordon never had a chance to escape. Afterward, Peter left the house believing he could simply walk away from what he had done. He cleaned himself as best he could, but the stains remained on his trousers when the camera captured him leaving. The same camera he probably never even thought about. That small device mounted beside the door became the silent witness that followed him long after he drove away. When confronted with the evidence, the video, the hammer, the forensic results, Peter finally confessed. What had started as a home improvement project had ended in murder. The case moved quickly through the courts. The evidence was overwhelming, and the doorbell camera footage became one of the most important pieces in the prosecution's case. Because without it, Peter's original claim might have created enough doubt to delay justice. But the camera had already told the truth. In court, the story of Sharon Gordon's final day was reconstructed piece by piece. Prosecutors presented the timeline, the long delays in construction, the growing frustration between homeowner and contractor, the argument that spiraled into violence. But the most powerful moment came when the jury watched the doorbell footage. Not the attack itself, but the quiet, ordinary moment afterward. Peter Norgrove walking calmly out of the house, blood visible on his clothing. Walking away from a crime scene as if it were just another finished workday. That image carried a chilling message, because it showed how quickly ordinary life can transform into something irreversible. A disagreement over work, a moment of anger, one violent decision, and suddenly a quiet home on a peaceful street becomes the site of a homicide. Peter eventually pleaded guilty to the murder. The court sentenced him to life in prison. Legally, the case was closed, but the footage remains a reminder of something unsettling about the world we now live in. For most of human history, crimes happened in silence. The truth depended on witnesses, confessions, or chance discoveries. But today, millions of homes are watched by silent cameras. They capture moments people never expected anyone would see. Moments of desperation, moments of violence, moments where someone believes they can simply walk away from what they've done. But the camera remembers. And sometimes those small devices mounted beside front doors become the only witness a victim ever has. Yet even murder investigations aren't always the most disturbing things these cameras record, because the next moment captured by a doorbell camera would show something far more unsettling. Not a killer, not a thief, but a woman standing outside a stranger's house in the middle of the night, trying to force her way inside while claiming someone inside had taken her friend.